Hi everyone, I'm Tim Clarke. I'm a third-year PhD student from the University of Waterloo. Though I'm here to talk to you about Indigenous peoples in Canada today, I actually studied the commemoration of the First World War in Africa, specifically Kenya. But early in 2017, I was offered the opportunity to work on a project with Dr. Whitney Lachenbauer, Indigenous Voices of the World Wars, Letters and Documents from the Department of Indian Affairs. So I've been transcribing and compiling letters for quite a few months now, with the ultimate goal of publishing those letters in an edited volume for greater dissemination. While I'm ostensibly here to speak to you about the effects of the First World War on Indigenous families, I'm actually also speaking about the role of the historian in truth and reconciliation. This talk is about a call to action for academics, institutions, policymakers to mobilize resources so that we can better understand the contributions of Indigenous peoples to the polity we now know as Canada. But I think before I move on, we need to redefine that word contribution in the case of Indigenous peoples. We often think of contributions as intentional acts towards a commonly identifiable cause. Contributions in this conception flow from willing participation, non-compulsory sacrifices, or the fulfillment of various socio-political obligations. But this definition has some serious consequences for how we frame history. As Dr. Lachenbauer and Dr. Sheffield have noted, the overwhelming desire to celebrate the service, sacrifices, and cooperation of First Nations individuals and communities has led to an oversimplified narrative. Though studies continue to proliferate, it's still clear that 10 years on from their call, there's a lot more work left to be done. Part of that work is to redefine contributions. So if we can confine contributions to intentional acts done with directed agency, we frame the idea of contribution in a positive light. But what I'll suggest today is that in the case of Indigenous families during the First World War, one of their contributions to Canadian society came from being on the losing end of a zero-sum game with the Canadian state and the Department of Indian Affairs. This was neither voluntary, nor did it stem from any mutual obligations. In fact, it was an abrogation of Canada's obligations to Indigenous peoples established through treaties. Though Indigenous folks often offered courageous displays of protest against the intrusion of the Canadian state on reserve during the First World War, their agency simply could not overcome the overwhelming weight of Canadian institutions. Dr. Catherine McGowan, who we'll hear from later today, has led the way in refocusing our understanding of the First World War towards those left on reserve, and my talk is greatly indebted to her. But ongoing research must include service-oriented endeavors like the Indigenous Letters of the World Wars Project. But before I come back to the TRC's calls to actions and my own call to action today, I'd like to talk about some of the general trends that I've identified within the letters that I've looked at. I'm going to focus on a particular subset of them, protests for the discharge of Indigenous boys and men serving in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. It's a small sample of letters, but I think they're important because they include protests from all levels of Indigenous communities, as well as personalized responses from very important figures within the Department of Indian Affairs. So the paper that I proposed for this conference is premised on a realization I had when I stumbled across a memorandum from A.E. Kemp, who was then Minister of Militia and Defense in February of 1917. The memorandum detailed, and I quote, methods of dealing with requests concerning soldiers serving overseas with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. In the case of the DIA, though, this memorandum was fairly inconsequential. They'd been dealing with requests for discharge for over 2 years at that point, and the memorandum really said nothing new. Kemp's remarked that, quote, the exigencies of the military situation must be the primary consideration, only gave the DIA another tool to supplant Indigenous communities. But the memorandum also exposes the key role the DIA played during the wartime in isolating Indigenous communities from the ultimate decision makers in military affairs, the Department of Militia and Defense. Though the DMD would make final decisions concerning any soldiers, for Indigenous communities and individuals left at home, the DIA filled a middleman role, essentially isolating those communities. Though through the imposition of institutional control over a long-term period, stemming from the creation of the department in 1880, the First World War afforded the DIA a crucial opportunity to display its ability to wield and extend that control. So this gives us a snapshot of the idiosyncratic development of a national bureaucratic structure underpinning colonialism. In order to present a more complex image of First Nations communities during the war, I believe we need to look at people who weren't of military age at the time. The DIA's control over information and political advocacy extended generational divides on reserves by consistently stymieing Indigenous protests for aid, information, and intervention. They did so through bureaucracy and obfuscation. Not only were Indigenous parents left without their sons, who often filled crucial labor sources or were primary caregivers and providers, but they were also doubly isolated from the fates of their sons simply by being identified as Indians. It should be noted that many Euro-Canadian families suffered from similar circumstances, but the racialization of Indigenous communities meant that there were some crucial differences with the DIA at the center. Even though at times this actually afforded Indigenous folks an additional ally in advocating for satisfactory outcomes, it was largely confined to worthy petitions, of which there were few. Indeed, in cases deemed unworthy, the DIA often deferred to the DMD, claiming the decisions were out of their control, quite rightly. This made the DIA's job extremely easy. In situations where future enlistment and recruitment and the cooperation of First Nations communities might be in danger, it could mobilize its institutional clout and its unique relationship with Indigenous folks to lobby the final decision makers. In any other case, it could revert to standard responses like, there's nothing that can be done, or even if the petition could be forwarded to the DMD, it would not receive a favorable response. Clearly, Indigenous folks left at home were at the behest of the DIA. Recruitment and enlistment practices likewise functioned in ways that denied or at least delayed information transmission to parents, elders, and First Nations leaders, as well as denying their inclusion in any enlistment decisions. Though First Nations communities and individuals responded differently to the demands of the First World War, ranging from outright opposition to full-fledged support, demands for respect for community decision-making, the inclusion of elders and local leaders, and restrained recruiting techniques on reserves were ubiquitous. But by shifting the decision-making to young men, promising similar incentives as their Euro-Canadian counterparts, adventure and escape, stable pay, and post-war benefits, recruiters and their Indian agent allies capitalized upon generational divides by shifting that decision-making. Even in cases where parents consented to enlistment, many communicated to Scott, Duncan Campbell Scott, and J.D. McLean that they did not understand what was happening and that various degrees of coercion were involved. This compounded anger and confusion, which would become all the more apparent after the passing of the Military Service Act in August 1917. Through these letters, I've defined what I believe to be an archetype of communication between the DIA and Indigenous communities during the First World War. As a result of wartime demands, the DIA not only continued its middleman role between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples, but also made sure that everything flowed through the office in Ottawa. Second, where it could, the DIA deferred to the DMD in response to petitioners, while still controlling the flow of information to and from Indigenous communities. Finally, the DIA subjected Indigenous petitioners to multiple layers of bureaucracy that further isolated them from the fates of their sons. Though this archetype of communication also affected Indigenous soldiers, in the words of Dr. McGowan, when the rights and restrictions contained in these two identities, Native and soldier, clashed, Native men discovered their Indian identity trumped their position as soldiers. It nonetheless affected those not serving even more, only having the one identity and thus even more limited outlets. Even as Indigenous petitioners strained to offer their support or protest of the Canadian war effort, older generations were consistently stripped of their political power by having to move through the DIA. No doubt, the short-term exigencies of the First World War, combined with the longer-term dictates of the Indian Act, affecting different age groups in very different ways. As a result, it's erroneous to categorize all Indigenous experiences in any universal terms. Unsurprisingly, this increase in DIA control came at the same time as an emboldened collective national identity amongst Euro-Canadians, even if that identity was more imagined than real. As I've mentioned previously, however, for Indigenous communities, Canada's coming of age was far too real. Not only did Indigenous policy become more embedded in the Canadian state rather than in the British Crown or in imperial structures, but the exigencies of the conflagration afforded the DIA an opportunity to not only test its structure, but also bolster and extend its power. Alas, as we've questioned Canada's coming of age in real terms within the Euro-Canadian community, for the DIA, the First World War was a coming of age, though perhaps not one we'd like to celebrate. Importantly, the DIA's control increased chronologically alongside the demands upon Canada's military capabilities. Through the DIA's institutional control, what D.C. Scott referred to as the beginning of a new era for them, wherein they shall play an increasingly honorable and useful part in the history of Canada, was largely restricted to those who had served. As it turned out, even those promises and expectations went largely unmet in the post-war context, a reality non-serving Indigenous folks might have been able to predict based on their own wartime experiences. On that last note, and as a disclaimer, this analysis focuses on similarities regardless of the diversity of communities, but that shouldn't take away from community-level analyses that give us a very different picture depending on what we focus on. That being said, Dr. Mark Osborne was indeed correct in 2014 when he stated, in reference to Canada's nationalist tradition of First World War histories, quote, "We need not wholly subscribe to the tenets of the old colony to nation thesis to write from nationalistic perspectives. In the case of First Nations community at home, the evolution of the Canadian state is not necessarily a celebratory mythos. It also represents a very real loss. If restoring sovereignty and decolonizing Canadian institutions is a goal of truth and reconciliation, we must engage these histories from a critical perspective so that we can better understand how the Canadian state stripped Indigenous peoples of their sovereignty. Key to this story are voices like Mrs. Margaret Crane of Hagersville, whose 3 sons put their lives on the line in Europe as early as Ypres in 1915, one of whom would never return. And Mrs. Jane Manitoaba, who would write one of the most impassioned, historically driven protests to the DIA. These 2 women are only examples of elders and community leaders from across the then 9 provinces of Canada who demanded equality, empathy, and respect before service. These are the men and women, alongside their sons who served, who should feature in our understanding of Indigenous experiences during the First World War. So by ways of conclusion, First Nations community leaders, elders, and families actively petitioned the government for the discharge of their young Indigenous men, but at every turn were subject to levels of bureaucracy that isolated them from the DMD, the Canadian state, and the British Crown, and most importantly, the fates of their sons. This confirms Catherine McGowan's observation that many Indigenous peoples had to increasingly define themselves within the confines of the Indian Act for any positive outcome, legitimizing DIA jurisdiction and thus Canadian sovereignty. It also builds upon work showing that the early 20th century is essential to understanding how the DIA increased its control over Indigenous communities and advanced its assimilationist policies with Scott at the helm. Thus, even in the face of active opposition and the preponderance of First Nation voices, predominantly women, the DIA seized the conditions of the First World War to turn an active dialogue between Indigenous peoples and various levels of government into a one-way, oppressive conversation dictated by the department's nascent bureaucratic structure. Though not a singular impetus for overwhelming DIA control, the First World War provided a pivotal moment that it could seize. It is not surprising in this context that Duncan Campbell Scott lauded Indigenous participation in the First World War, especially by highlighting loyalty and other traits thought to be evidence of the success of the civilizational program. Equally unsurprising is historians focused on the forgotten warrior trope until the late 2000s, which, while different in kind, represents a very similar type of analysis. However, a new facet of the effects of the First World War upon Indigenous peoples and communities emerges by simply refocusing the analysis to those who were affected by the absence of men, and who were left, as a result, to negotiate with the DIA, the oldest members in First Nations communities. In doing so, historians can tell different stories of family and community struggle and sacrifice. Ultimately, what this tells us about studying the effects of the First World War is that historians need to continue crafting histories that respect complexity and deny overly simplistic generalizations about Indigenous communities and individuals. Further, more First Nations voices need to be heard. Not only do they need to be heard from the archives, but within the academy as well. With the exception of a few strong Indigenous voices studying the First World War, it is often settler historians, like myself, who have studied the topic. While no topic should ever be exclusive to a particular community, turning a population to a pedagogical subject, something that's just taught, rather than embracing their voices, is also unacceptable. But this cannot simply remain within the academy. It must also be reflected in secondary school classrooms, where most students first encounter curricular materials related to the First World War. Connecting secondary school educators and First Nation communities with materials that allow for a more diverse, non-Euro-Canadian focus is essential not only for a more dynamic understanding of the war, but also for the fulfillment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. This process must be focused on providing our future scholars, especially from First Nations communities, with the materials and toolkits to participate in the ongoing discovery of our collective history, a history that must not deny self-determination and the decolonization of Canadian institutions. Finally, as Canadians reckon with the ugly facets of our history, inextricable to our foundation as a nation state with a distinct culture, academics bear a particular responsibility to use our resources and tools to further this endeavor. Even with Canada's sesquicentennial celebrations and reflections winding to a close, we must continue to reappraise how and at whose expense this polity came into being. Thanks.